The summer air in Atlanta was a thick, humid blanket that clung to Aaliyah's skin. It smelled of asphalt, sun-baked earth, and the distant, sweet scent of honeysuckle vines that scaled the chain-link fences of her neighborhood. The city was a symphony of constant, humming sounds. The far-off drone of highway traffic, the rhythmic whir of a lawnmower, the piercing, shrill song of a cicada that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. She walked with a purpose that felt new to her, her backpack slung over her left shoulder, its weight an unfamiliar, satisfying pressure. At 13, she was a study in contradictions. Tall for her age, with a slender athletic build that suggested an untamable energy. Yet she moved with a quiet, introspective grace. Her box braids adorned with small, colorful beads clinked softly with each step, a tiny percussive sound in the vast silence of her own thoughts. Her mind was elsewhere, adrift in the vast, complicated landscape of her own anxieties, which often swirled around the distant, unreadable nature of her father. She had her mother's large, expressive eyes, and her father's thoughtful, slightly reserved mouth. Her gaze was often fixed on something beyond the immediate, as if she were always searching for a world just out of reach. Aaliyah felt things deeply, a fierce wave of compassion that was both her greatest strength and the source of her deepest fears. Her greatest terror was to disappoint her father, to fail to earn his silent, hard-won approval. She often acted first and thought later, a trait driven by a heart that felt everything with an overwhelming intensity. It was this very intensity that pulled her off her usual path and down a forgotten alleyway. The air here was cooler, still and damp, a stark contrast to the sun-drenched street. The ground was slick with a recent rain shower, and the scent of wet soil and forgotten things was thick in the air. A low, desperate sound, a whimper that was almost a gasp, cut through the quiet. Her head snapped up, her senses heightened. She saw him then, a small shape, a ball of mud-colored fur trembling beside a dented trash can. He was a small mutt, a pitiful, scraggly thing with one ear flopped over and the other standing at a timid, wary angle. His eyes were wide, dark pools, almost entirely pupil, filled with a raw, panicked fear that squeezed Aaliyah's chest so tight she could barely breathe. She felt it, a profound, urgent sense of recognition. This small, vulnerable creature, alone in a cold, unforgiving world. It was an impulsive, unthinking act of defiance and love. With a quiet prayer to the humid air, she knelt down, ignoring the slick dampness that soaked into her jeans. She held out her hand, a soft, whispered word, a promise against the silence. The puppy flinched, a flash of white fear in his eyes, but his trembling lessened. The touch was the first thing. The feeling of his thin, wiry fur against her skin, the frantic thump, thump, thump of his tiny heart against her palm. He was a bundle of fragile bone and shaking muscle. She scooped him up, the weight of him both terrifying and grounding, a new and startling responsibility that felt right in her hands. She opened her backpack, the canvas smelling of old textbooks and the faint, sweet scent of a pencil sharpener. She carefully placed him inside, the soft weight settling against the small of her back. The zipper closed with a quiet, final rasp, sealing a secret between them. The walk home felt different now. The mundane sights and sounds of her neighborhood were tinged with a new, urgent significance. She felt the warmth of his small body through the backpack, the occasional, quiet sound of a whimper or a soft sigh that was so fragile it was almost a breath. The scent of wet dog and old canvas was a constant presence, a telltale sign that could be a betrayer. Every car that drove past, every neighbor she waved to, felt like a threat. The simple act of walking became a delicate ballet of caution and control. The thrill of the secret was a cold, delicious lump in her throat, a feeling she had never experienced before. She slipped through the front door of her house, a soft click of the latch and a prayer. Her mother, Ayanna, was in the kitchen, a gentle humming sound, a soft counterpoint to the clink of a glass against the counter. Aaliyah could feel her mother's warmth and calm from the hallway. Ayanna was the heart of the home, a gentle and loving soul who always seemed to know the unspoken truths. Her father, David, was likely in his study, the sound of his laptop keyboard a staccato rhythm that meant he was focused, distant. The house, usually a place of quiet comfort, now felt like a cage, every sound a potential accusation. She scurried to her room, her feet silent on the plush carpet. The click of her bedroom door locking was a small victory, a moment of safety that was as fleeting as it was sweet. She placed her backpack on the floor, the soft thud a relief. She unzipped it slowly, the tiny dark eyes of the puppy meeting hers. She carefully pulled him out, holding him close to her chest. He was a mess of damp, matted fur and trembling limbs. But in her eyes, he was perfect. She made a nest for him in her closet, using an old, soft t-shirt and a blanket that still smelled faintly of her own perfume. She fetched a small bowl of water and some crackers, a makeshift meal for a makeshift life. She watched as he slurped at the water, the small, frantic sounds filling the silence of her room. The act of caring for this tiny, vulnerable creature felt like the most important thing she had ever done, a quiet and profound proof of her own responsibility. She named him in her head then, a small, affectionate sound. Peanut. As the sun set, the golden light of the streetlights filtering through her blinds, the house began to stir. I heard the front door open, the low rumble of her father's voice. The sound, normally a source of comfort, now sent a shiver of fear down her spine. The low, controlled tone in his voice was a sign of his seriousness, his unflinching sense of order. She knew his words would be about rules, about reason, about responsibility. He was a man defined by a deep fear of instability, a man who believed that his role was to protect his family from the chaos of the world. Her secret, a bundle of joy and warmth tucked away in her closet, was a disruption to that order. As she watched Peanut curl up into a small, snoring ball of fur, her own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The secret was safe for now, but the knowledge that it could not last forever was a heavy weight on her young soul. The story had begun, and she had no idea what the ending would be.
Aaliyah's life settled into a rhythm of silent, small responsibilities. The house itself became a landscape of potential dangers and hidden opportunities. The creak of a floorboard near her bedroom door could be her father, and the soft rustle of her mother, Ayanna, moving through the hallway was a warning. She moved with a newfound stealth, her long limbs gliding over the carpeted floor as if trying to not disturb a sleeping dragon. The sanctuary she had created for Peanut in her closet was a universe unto itself. It smelled faintly of her old t-shirt, of the clean, washed scent of her blankets, and a new, distinct smell, the warm, earthy odor of a puppy. She had become a silent conspirator in her own home, the secret a heavy, thrilling weight that she carried alone. Her daily rituals were now dedicated to her charge. She learned to steal food from the kitchen with the stealth of a cat, a small sliver of chicken from dinner, a few pieces of kibble from a neighbor's bag of dog food that had been left on their porch. Each item was a carefully planned act of espionage. She would fill a tiny plastic container with water from the bathroom sink, the quiet trickle of the faucet a drumbeat to her frantic heart. Peanut, in his vulnerable state, was a constant source of anxiety and a wellspring of quiet joy. His small wet snores and the way his tiny body quivered with dreams were a constant reassurance that he was there, alive, a promise she was keeping. The tension in the house began to build, a subtle, unspoken current that vibrated beneath the surface of their peaceful suburban life. David, Aaliyah's father, was a man of routines and predictable order. He would often pass by her bedroom, his large, calloused hands resting on the doorframe, a silent check-in. She would be sitting at her desk, a book open on the surface, but her mind would be 100 miles away, attuned to the slightest sound from her closet. He would often ask her how her day was, his voice, a low, steady rumble, and she would answer in a way that was too quick, too bright. He noticed the changes, the way she seemed more withdrawn, the nervous energy that hummed around her, the way she would clutch her book with a little too much force. He was a man who observed with a quiet and deliberate focus. He didn't see the puppy, but he saw the signs of something new, something hidden, and it unsettled him. The quiet distance between them, a familiar chasm, widened into a gulf of unspoken suspicion. Ayana, her mother, was the emotional anchor of the family, a quiet observer whose wisdom was often unsaid. She noticed the way Aaliyah's eyes would dart towards her closet, the way her daughter's hands, so often restless in emotion, would be still, listening. She didn't confront her daughter. Instead, she offered small, silent acts of support. A cup of hot cocoa left on her desk late at night, a soft, warm blanket laid across her chair. She was a bridge between the two most important people in her life, a silent mediator who understood that the heart, not just the head, needed its own set of rules. She saw the change in Aaliyah, the new sense of responsibility that emanated from her, and she instinctively knew that it was tied to something good, something rooted in love and compassion. The climax of this silent dance came one humid afternoon. Aaliyah had just returned from a quick, nervous walk to a corner store, her backpack clutched tightly in her hand. She had a bag of cheap, dry dog treats, the smell of which was already permeating the canvas. She hurried down the hallway. The sound of her father's voice from the living room was a low, steady hum. He was on the phone, the tone of his conversation serious. She tried to slip past his study door, her body pressed against the wall. The hallway seemed to stretch for miles, every step a thunderous sound. Suddenly, his voice cut through the air, low and quiet, but as sharp as a blade. He had hung up and was standing in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on her, on the backpack, and the soft, telltale whimper that came from within. The small, fragile world she had built was about to collapse. The secret was out, betrayed not by a loud noise or a careless act, but by a quiet sound and an observant eye. The scent of the dog treats, a cheap, artificial smell, hung in the air, like a confession.
The silence was heavier than any words, a suffocating weight that pressed in on Aaliyah from all sides. The light from the living room behind David cast his silhouette in the doorway, a figure of silent, immovable authority. She felt the sudden, frantic beat of the puppy's heart against her back, a tiny, terrified drum. The cheap, artificial scent of the dog treats was a scream in the quiet of the hallway, a confession she couldn't retract. He didn't move. His face was a mask of careful stillness, but she saw the slight tick in his jaw, the way his large hands, so often a source of quiet comfort, now hung at his sides with a tension that spoke of contained fury. "What is that, Aaliyah?" he finally asked, his voice a low, even murmur that was more terrifying than any shout. The question wasn't a question at all. It was a statement, an accusation. She felt the heat of a flush rise up her neck and flood her cheeks. Her fingers tightened around the straps of her backpack, a desperate, useless attempt to keep the secret contained. She looked away, her eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet, unable to meet the direct, unblinking gaze she knew was fixed on her. She had been caught. The intricate, fragile world she had built for herself and for Peanut had been shattered by a single telltale sound. He moved then, a deliberate and unhurried step into the hallway, forcing her to retreat. He knelt down, not in anger, but in emotion so controlled it made her flinch. He unzipped the backpack slowly, the sound of the zipper a final, devastating sound of surrender. She felt the rush of cold air as he took the backpack from her back, the sudden loss of the warm, living weight feeling like a profound abandonment. He pulled out the tiny, shivering creature. Peanut's eyes were wide with fear, a raw and panicked terror that mirrored her own. David held him for a moment, the small bundle of fur dwarfed by his large, work-worn hands. Aaliyah wanted to plead,
to explain, but the words were lodged in her throat, a hard, useless lump. He looked from the puppy to her, the line of his mouth a thin, hard line. His eyes, usually so thoughtful and kind, were now a cold, unreadable slate. He told her quietly that a dog was not a toy. He reminded her, without raising his voice, of the rules of the house, rules she had known her entire life. He mentioned that a pet was a significant responsibility, a commitment that required more than just a whim. She knew his words were true, but they were not the whole truth. She knew the responsibility was what she had sought, what she was trying to prove. She saw her father's disapproval in every line of his face, in the tight set of his shoulders, in the way he held the puppy at arm's length, as if it were something foreign, something unwanted. Ayana's quiet presence was a gentle counterpoint to the tense scene. She had entered the hallway and was standing behind David, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She didn't speak. Her eyes, filled with a deep, knowing empathy, met Aaliyah's over her husband's shoulder. She was a silent plea, a living testament to the love that existed in the house despite the current crushing atmosphere. She saw David's pain, too. She knew it was not just about the dog. It was about something much deeper, a memory or a hurt that she herself couldn't fully comprehend. David finally placed the puppy on the ground. The small creature took a wobbly step before collapsing, a quivering ball of nerves. Aaliyah's heart ached for him. He stood up slowly, the movement heavy and deliberate. He told her, his voice still low, controlled and precise, that she had 5 days to find Peanut a new home. His words were a final, unchangeable verdict. 5 days. The number felt like a countdown to her own impending heartbreak. She heard her father's logic about the need to give the dog a better life, a life she couldn't provide, but his words felt hollow, a flimsy excuse for a much harder, colder truth she didn't yet understand. Aaliyah's world, a world of silent, desperate hope, had come to an end. Her secret, so full of quiet purpose, was now a painful reality, a source of conflict, and her father's disappointment. She wanted to scream, to cry, to beg, but his face was an impassive, unyielding wall. She knew in that moment that no amount of tears or promises would change his mind. He turned and walked away, the low rumble of his footsteps fading as he returned to his study, leaving her alone in the silent hallway with her small, quivering charge. The weight of his ultimatum settled on her shoulders, a burden far heavier than any backpack. The quiet, devastating truth was out, and with it, a new kind of loneliness had taken root in her heart. The story had become a race against the clock, a desperate search for a happy ending that she wasn't sure was possible.
David was a man who believed in the order of things. He returned to his study, the familiar scent of old books and faint pine from the cleaning supplies a comfort in its predictability. He settled into his leather armchair, the worn softness of the material a familiar weight against his back. He picked up the newspaper, the rustle of the pages, a steady, soothing sound, yet his eyes didn't track the words on the page. His mind was a maelstrom of thoughts, and against his will, a series of old, painful memories that had been dormant for decades began to surface. He remembered the feel of the rough, bristled rug beneath his 10-year-old knees, the scent of pipe tobacco, and the cold, unyielding air of his own father's study. He watched Aaliyah from the window. The image of her hunched over the little dog was a sharp, piercing pain in his chest. He saw her gentle hands carefully scooping water into a small bowl, the low, whispered words she spoke to the trembling creature. She was so different from him, her heart so readily open to the world's hurts. He saw her responsibility, the deliberate and careful way she moved around the animal, and the memory returned with a visceral, suffocating force. He was a boy again, begging his father, Roy, for a dog. He remembered the boy's desperation, the way he would describe the dog to his friends, the way he would imagine the long walks in the park, the endless games of fetch. He wanted it so badly it was a physical ache, a phantom limb he was always reaching for. He recalled the way he had approached his own father, a man whose presence was as solid and unyielding as a slab of granite, a man who believed in practicality and the hard, unyielding lessons of a world that didn't give second chances. He heard his father's voice, a low and gravelly sound that seemed to come from the very ground beneath their feet. He told his son that pets were an unnecessary luxury, a weakness that could be exploited. But the truth, the real truth, was something colder and sharper. He remembered his father, a man whose face was a mask of careful stillness, saying in a voice that was devoid of any emotion that as long as he lived under his roof, he would never have a dog. The words had been a hammer blow to his spirit. It wasn't about the dog at all. It was about a denial of love, a denial of the soft, innocent joy that his father believed would make him weak. His father had carried the scars of his own past, of a history where his own family had been torn apart by forces beyond their control. He was a man who had to be strong, to deny himself and his children the comfort that could be taken away. He was not being cruel. He was trying to protect his son from a disappointment that he knew was inevitable in a world that wasn't built for men like them to be soft. David's own pain, a silent and unyielding grief, had been passed down like a family heirloom. He saw his younger self in his daughter's quiet sorrow. The way her eyes, so often bright with light, now seemed to hold the silent, defeated sadness of an old woman. He understood the desperate longing in her soul, the need to nurture and protect something that was broken and alone. Her act of defiance wasn't about him. It was an act of pure, unadulterated love, a fierce rejection of the notion that the world was only filled with hard things. His father's words echoed in his mind, but they were no longer a command. They were a question. He had built a life of stability and security, a fortress against the chaos he had feared his entire life. But was he, in his attempt to protect his daughter from disappointment, denying her the very joy that had been taken from him? He was a man who believed that the strength of a family is in their ability to face the world together, to be a buffer against the cruelty of prejudice and discrimination. But what if, in his attempt to protect her from that pain, he was passing down his own trauma, his own fear of connection and loss? He realized that her act of saving the puppy was a deep, spiritual act of resilience, a way of creating joy in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. It was the very embodiment of the black joy that his family had cultivated for generations, an internal wellspring of power that affirmed her agency and defied the idea that violence and injustice were normal. His jaw softened. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The physical sensation of his hands against his face, a grounding comfort. He saw the truth then, a quiet and profound realization that settled over him like a warm blanket. He was not his father. He had the power to break the cycle, to rewrite the end of a story that had haunted him for decades. His daughter wasn't just taking care of a dog. She was healing a part of his own history, an act of silent, unintentional love that was more powerful than any words. He knew what he had to do. He had to lead with love, not with the rigidity he had been taught. He had to choose joy.
The 5-day ultimatum was a slow and agonizing countdown. Aaliyah spent the days trying to find a new home for Peanut, making phone calls to friends, texting, and even creating a sad little flyer she taped to a lamppost. But the world seemed to have closed in on her, and no one had a place for a scruffy, abandoned mutt. Each day was a weight on her shoulders, a testament to her failure.
The morning of the 5th day, she woke to a silent house, a stillness that was more ominous than any noise. The little nest in her closet was empty now, the blankets folded and the small food and water bowls put away. She was meticulously cleaning her room, a quiet, mournful ritual. She was not just cleaning her space, she was scrubbing away the last vestiges of a dream she had dared to have. It was in this moment of quiet, sorrowful work that her father, David, found her. He stood in the doorway, a familiar, imposing figure, but something was different. The hard line of his jaw had softened, the tension in his shoulders had eased. He didn't speak, he just watched her, his eyes taking in the details, the small, clean bowls, the empty space in her closet, the way she ran her hand over the polished surface of her desk, a small, sad gesture of farewell. He saw not a disobedient child, but a young woman who had stepped into responsibility with a quiet, fierce determination. He saw his own fear, the rigid rules he had created, and he understood them now for what they were, a painful echo of his own past, not a safeguard against a painful future. The memory of his father's words, "As long as you live under my roof," echoed in his mind, but they no longer had the power to sting. They were a faded memory, a lesson learned and now overcome. The silent actions of his daughter, her unwavering love for the puppy, her commitment to its well-being, her quiet surrender, had taught him a new kind of strength. He realized that the greatest form of protection he could offer his daughter was not to shield her from a world of disappointment, but to give her the freedom to find her own joy, to lead with her own heart. He had the power to break the cycle, to choose love over fear. He had the power to rewrite the ending of a story that had haunted his own childhood. He walked into the room and knelt down on the floor, the movement slow and deliberate, a physical manifestation of his surrender. He didn't look at her, but at the empty space in the closet. "I've been thinking about what my father said," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that was thick with emotion. He didn't talk about the dog, or the rules, or her deception. He spoke about a father who was trying to protect his son from a world he thought was too dangerous for love. And he told her that he had been wrong, that he had been trying to do the same thing, to protect her by teaching her the same hard lesson he had learned. Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears, a sudden, powerful release of the pressure she had been holding inside for days. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He stood up slowly, and his eyes, now soft and full of love that she hadn't seen in days, met hers. He told her quietly that the dog could stay. The words were a simple act of absolution, a quiet, powerful promise that the love between them was stronger than any rules. He watched her as she went to the closet, her hands fumbling with the small door as she reached for the puppy. She pulled him out, a small, trembling bundle of fur, and held him close to her chest. Peanut, sensing a change, licked her cheek, a small, wet gesture of his own affection. The story didn't end with a big, dramatic embrace or a flood of happy tears. It ended with a quiet, shared moment. David sat on the edge of her bed, watching as she cradled the puppy, her fingers stroking his soft, muddy fur. He had made a choice not just to let the dog stay, but to let go of his own past. Aaliyah had not only earned the right to keep her pet, she had, in her own way, taught her father a new and profound lesson about love, compassion, and the enduring strength of the human heart. The house that had felt like a cage for days now felt like a home again, filled with the warmth of a quiet, unspoken understanding between a father and his daughter. The low, soft snores of Peanut were no longer a sign of a secret, but a quiet, constant soundtrack to a love that had just grown a little deeper. The story was over, but the bond had just begun.